I'm Craig Chalkwist. I'm a core faculty member of the Department of East-West Psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies, as well as adjunct faculty at John F. Kennedy University and Pacifica Graduate Institute. And I created this slideshow because although there's no lack of news about all the trouble we're in ecologically and otherwise as debts come due all over the world, and also there's no absence of suggestions for fixing these problems, few are talking about what it all means, what the big picture is. And so I created the show to float my idea about one way of holding all this and understanding what it's telling us. So in part one, we'll look at why our worldviews matter, because the worldview idea is the crux, the pivot on which this slideshow turns. In part two, we'll look at what is Earthrise, beyond being an image sent back to us from the Apollo 8 astronauts in 1968. In part three, we'll talk about what it means to welcome this image, and in part four, how we can appreciate Earthrise and the Earth itself. So why do worldviews matter? Worldviews organize our realities, our ideas, values, relationships, how we see ourselves, religions that we're involved in, religions that we're not, ethnic groups, sense of gender, and even institutions like governments and movements all are framed through the lens of our worldview, of how we see reality, how we see ourselves, how we see each other and the world around us. Worldviews frame what drives us. They give shape to the sense of meaning we have in our lives. Even when the worldviews are very different, they perform some of the same basic functions. They give us a frame of orientation, and also they frame our aspirations, whether, as in the images on the left, we're all consulting our manuals, or the images on the right, embracing a sense of enthusiasm and ecstasy. Worldviews compete with each other. And worldviews eventually wear out as consciousness moves beyond them. Now, when we cling to an outworn worldview, and when we do that without adapting it to our current time, that worldview no longer functions as a useful lens for navigating our way through life. Instead, it occludes more than it lets into consciousness, and at that point, it functions defensively as an absolute ideology. And at that point, it becomes dangerous. It almost doesn't matter what the content is. It's the fact of its rigidity that makes it psychologically important, culturally too. A few examples of this. The fundamentalist worldview and the violence that's so often connected with it. An ideology that we have to distinguish from traditional religiosity. Materialism as an ideology. Extremism doesn't confine itself to politics or religion. Any worldview that hardens into an ideology and begins blocking out big pieces of what we think of as reality, any ideology that does that becomes inherently extremist. the Edenic ideology and its tendency to idealize the natural world while disparaging what we think of as civilization. And this ideology, the mechanist ideology, is very dominant in our time. As an example of its consequences. When a worldview becomes an ideology and no longer functions as a lens, then we're caught in it, and all we see is how it processes reality. We can't escape from its thinking. And so children sit in rows like products in a factory or circuits in a machine. We don't have the worldview anymore, it has us. Petroleum, as part of the mechanistic worldview, built a lot of what we think of as civilization. It gave us garments and agriculture and plastics and buildings and energy. But when taken too far, it burns rivers. The upper left image is the Cuyahoga River. In ancient Greece, they would have called it Phlegethon, the fiery river in the underworld. And where petroleum flows, the underworld tends to show up right afterwards. It took millions of years for the Earth to sequester carbon into the ground and make our atmosphere breathable so that life could flourish, moving in a vast cycle from non-living to living. By putting extra carbon back into the air, our fossil fuels reverse that great cycle and move us all from life to lifelessness. When a worldview hardens into an ideology, it also blocks our emotional development. And so we have the spectacle of many people, especially those who presume to lead us, walking around in adult bodies, but actually functioning at the emotional level of 5-year-olds or even younger. When a worldview is held by large groups of people, when it's a collective worldview, and when it contains an archetypal image or pattern or motif at the core of it, we can refer to it as an paradigm, a worldview that dominates large pieces of historical process. These big collective worldviews rise, they have their day in the sun for a while, and then they fade as consciousness moves on. They never entirely go away. But what happens every now and then is that a new paradigm, a new collective worldview containing an archetypal image, fascinating to millions of people, eventually rises and it replaces the old paradigms. And so the new one has vitality, it's numinous, it grips the imagination. An obvious example is the big machine worldview that rose around the time of the scientific and industrial revolutions. That worldview has been dominant for the past 400 years or so. Is another paradigm, another collective worldview rising above the rim of human consciousness? That brings us to Earthrise. On the day before Christmas in 1968, astronaut Frank Borman looked out the window of the spacecraft that was rounding the edge of the lip of the moon, and he saw the Earth rising above the horizon, and he said these words. And you notice that the reaction of both astronauts, Borman and Anders, is not cool and detached and what we tend to normally think of as scientific, objective. It's actually an aesthetic response. It's a deeply emotional response straight from the heart. This image was so powerful when it returned to Earth that some have said that the modern environmental movement actually arises from it. And so during an interview, Bill Moyers, the journalist, asks Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, in the Power of Myth series, so you suggest that from this begins the new myth of our time, this image of Earthrise? And Campbell says, yes, this is the ground of what the myth is to be. When you see the Earth from the moon, you don't see any differences, divisions there of nations or states. This might be the symbol, really, for the new mythology to come. So let's talk about myth for a moment to understand what he meant. There's a bias in our culture that myth is an explanation for what we understand scientifically, but a myth is far more than that. Myth actually gives us a collective story about who we are and where we came from and what our place is in the more than human world. You could think of a myth as a cultural counterpart to a dream, just as individuals have dreams which compensate for the blind side of all of us during our daily life. Then in just the same way, myth arises in image, in art, in worldview to compensate for the blind spots of a collective. So a myth shows us what's underneath the surface of our consciousness. By doing so, it becomes a repository of cultural insight, and it makes the deep psyche visible to us through metaphor and image and motif. Myths are basic psychic structures. So a few quotations about what myth is. What we are to our inward vision and what man appears to be under the aspect of eternity can only be expressed by way of myth. C.G. Jung. Myth speaks to the extraordinary in us and to the innate nobility of our souls. Michael Meade. Our powerful hunger for myth is a hunger for community. The person without a myth is a person without a home. Rollo May. Myth is the foundation of life. It is the timeless pattern, the religious formula to which life shapes itself. Thomas Mann. And because myth is a basic structure of the psyche, a basic foundation of experience, it never goes away and it doesn't stay in the myth books. Myths recur all around us. As Joseph Campbell put it in The Hero with a Thousand Faces, the latest incarnation of Oedipus, the continued romance of Beauty and the Beast, stand this afternoon on the corner of 42nd and 5th, waiting for the traffic light to change. Myth is in our movies. Apollo is a good, appropriate name for trying to aim spacecraft like arrows of the Archer of Heaven. Myths recur in business names, sports teams, movies, literary productions, old stories. No matter how technological we become, no matter how modern and rational we think we are, myth always rears up its heads again to remind us of our ancient roots. If we tend these myths consciously when they occur, then we can gain some wisdom about what they have to tell us in the same way that we can interpret dreams. Myths and dreams give us an exact metaphorical picture of what's happening with ourselves and with our relationships and with the planet around us during specific historical times. Myths and dreams come from the same place, and the only myth that is going to be worth thinking about in the immediate future is the one that is talking about the planet. Not the city, not these people, but the planet and everybody on it. That's my main thought for what the future myth is going to be. Now, when an academic is being interviewed, that is probably not the right time to correct a misperception. And so Moyers had asked about a myth for our time, and Campbell went with that and talked to him about it. But Campbell was well aware, as other interviews and other writings indicate, that there can be no single myth that will encapsulate all of human experience, no single totalistic story that can frame everything that happens. But there can be mythic images. The technical term is mytheme, the core, the nucleus of a myth. And those occasionally arise from human consciousness and create many networks of stories across cultures, not on top of them, to frame our relationship with the planet as it changes. And in our time, Earthrise, for Joseph Campbell and Moyers, seems to be one such powerful, impactful mythic image, bringing us out of the age of the big machine and moving us toward a worldview of participation and inclusion and ecological awareness. Of course, there have always been nature gods and goddesses. All over the world, many different pantheons and cultures, times and places. We often refer to them as earth goddesses. But in the times that these myths came to be, there was no way to have the experience that we can now enjoy of seeing the entire Earth from space. This is a new psychological experience for human beings, and it doesn't so much cause, in a simple linear fashion, new things as announce new potentials in a new worldview. To demonstrate that, I want to include a few quotations from astronauts who went up in space and looked at the Earth from orbit and were permanently and deeply transformed. Notice the power of this mythic image. Only after the middle of the century did man, having gone up above the Earth into space, see with surprise and disbelief just how small the Earth really is. Pavel Popovich, Romania. The Earth was small, light blue, and so touchingly alone, our home that must be defended like a holy relic. Alexei Leonov, Russia. From space I saw Earth, indescribably beautiful, with the scars of national boundaries gone. Mohammed Ahmed Faris, Syria. For the first time in my life, I saw the horizon as a curved line. It was accentuated by a thin seam of dark blue light, our atmosphere. Obviously, this was not the ocean of air I had been told it was so many times in my past, so many times in my life. I was terrified by its fragile appearance. Ulf Merbold, Germany. My mental boundaries expanded when I viewed the Earth against a black and uninviting vacuum, yet my country's rich traditions had conditioned me to look beyond man-made boundaries and prejudices. One does not have to undertake a space flight to come by this feeling. Rakesh Sharma, India. Now I know why I'm here. Not for a closer look at the moon, but to look back at our home, the Earth. Alfred Worden, USA. This is a photograph taken from space of the Southern Lights. My view of our planet was a glimpse of divinity. Edgar Mitchell, USA. Notice all the things that coincide with Earthrise as an announcement of a new worldview. They all thematically belong together. It's as though we're taking the image now and unfolding it a little bit and seeing it radiate from ecology and eco-psychology to environmentalism and ecofeminism, internet, field theory, interspecies communication, cradle-to-cradle industry to eliminate waste. The whole emphasis now on sustainability. movements of emancipation, liberatory, diverse, participatory. What Joanna Macy calls the great turning away from the industrial growth model of society to life-sustaining Earth civilization. The Earth Charter Initiative, Declaration of Human Rights, transition towns to move us into a post-carbon future. Any mythic image that's this powerful inevitably casts a shadow, especially when it's being held unconsciously. When we relate to a myth consciously, we can integrate its insights, but when we are unconscious of it, then the myth rules us. This is what's happening with unregulated globalization and transnational companies that have power beyond any national governments or national boundaries. As an example of actually acting on this model of Earthrise as the mythic image of our time, I've been meeting with a group of former and current students at CIIS in San Francisco, and we've been working on something called Encyclopedia Sophia. What we're striving for is a multi-platform resource for people that we call culture mentors or deep educators. And these are people who do many different kinds of transformative community work. Examples would be creating conflict resolution scenarios in the corporate world or even the political world, doing culture dreaming, inviting entire groups to dream about nature and earth, for instance. Many different kinds of work. You could think of them as world therapists rather than as individual or personal therapists. This resource, when completed, will be free and accessible from all over the world and on many different media. And so people who do this sort of transformative work with culture will be able to access it and get ideas about how to do it from their fellow mentors. So if you're, let's say, creating a garden, and gardens are great magnets of community, all kinds of diverse populations show up there and talk to each other, and then it gives you the challenge of bringing everyone together and for conversation and maybe a little bit of dreaming your way forward. You know, what do we want this neighborhood to be? What do we want our community to be? So you call up Encyclopedia Sophia online or on your phone or on a pad, and you see articles. You will see articles in the future on how to create community around gardens. We also want the encyclopedia to be a networking hub for everyone who does this sort of deep transformative cultural work. When I was a boy reading a lot of science fiction and fantasy, I came across, of course, the work of H.G. Wells. And he's known in the U.S. mainly as a science fiction writer. In Europe, he's also known as a futurist and a social critic and a historian, among other things. Toward the end of his life, Wells was asked who he was, how he thought of himself, and he said something that has haunted me for years. He said, "I am English by origin, but I am early world man, and I live in exile from the world community of my desire." Since then, as I've thought about this and felt a kinship with what he was saying, I've sometimes had dreams of the just and sustainable and delightful world civilization that perhaps he envisioned and that shows up as future possibilities in my dreams and the dreams of many other people. Jung talked about how in the unconscious is not only the past and old wounds and old business, but also the seeds of the future, as though possibilities not yet taken were waiting for realization, pulling us forward and not just pushing us from behind. And so I got to thinking, if there is a community of our desire, a world community, waiting up in the future. If that's in fact true, imaginally and as a potential, then doesn't it make sense that that community would already be here in some form or another and just need a little bit of assembly and perhaps a lot of networking in order to make all the different experiments going on work together under a common vision, an Earthrise vision of who we could be here. As we reimagine how to live on this planet with each other and with our non-human kindred, it's important to keep in mind that aesthetic dimension that we saw with the two astronauts who saw Earthrise for the first time. We will not protect what we do not love. So part of the work under the aegis of Earthrise, it seems to me, is learning how to reattach ourselves and reconnect with the beauty of our planet as well as all the other destructive things that are happening on it. It's as though the beauty all around us were an invitation, a standing invitation to participate more deeply in what's all around us. For instance, Albert Einstein once said that the thing that astonished him the most about the world and the universe was that it was so orderly. And the world of nature has been infinitely generous in creating even the most complex forms of order from simple, basic patterns used over and over again. This might be a clue about how to form new kinds of culture, the kinds of culture that we'd actually delight in participating in and feel included in. A few basic forms, a few basic visions, and see what develops from that. During this time of Earthrise, interspecies communication research has blossomed enormously. It's breaking down what many people call the big lie of our mastery of nature and the fact that we think of ourselves as somehow detached from nature, which James Hillman refers to as a thought disorder. So a few examples of what we're noticing. In the upper left corner there, that's Netta DeMaio with a horse that she rescued. Netta has a wild horse sanctuary in Lompoc, which is near Santa Barbara. And if you go to returntofreedom.org, you can read a little bit about what she does there. The horses get to travel in herds. And occasionally she takes people up into the hills to see the horses, but whether the horses visit is entirely at their discretion. And I can tell you from having gone on a couple of these tours that a horse in the wild is completely different in demeanor than a horse that you would see penned up at a ranch. The upper right corner, that's Oscar the cat. He works in a hospice, and Oscar became famous a couple of years ago when the hospice workers discovered that just before somebody was getting ready to die, Oscar would somehow go into their room, and he wasn't trained to do this. He knew they were leaving, and so he would curl up next to them in order to see them on. In the lower right corner is a dog who's been showing up at the riots happening as a result of what are euphemistically called austerity measures in Greece. And many times the police will be marching down on the protesters, and the dog will lay down in front of them and stop them. And in the lower right corner, a dog was chained up, and the owner came outside when he saw a polar bear approaching, and he couldn't reach the dog in time to unchain it, and he was very afraid that the polar bear would harm the dog, but to his surprise, they just started playing with each other. Awareness of our animal kindred and all the conversations that they're having with us and with each other is also part of this Earthrise consciousness. So a few questions to take with you. If we really felt at home here, might we outgrow the impulse to displace other people? Might we build differently? Might we grow things differently? This is the Central Valley of California, and this is the Central Valley of California. Might Pluto give way in influence to Terra, the Roman name of Gaia? And might our species finally reach adulthood? This is from Jung's recently published Red Book. It's a book that came out of his journals during a very psycho-spiritually turbulent time for him. He recorded his inner visions and dreams and artwork, and a wisdom figure named Philemon in the Red Book spoke these words as prophecy. The earth became green and fruitful again from the blood of sacrifice. Flowers sprouted, the waves crash into the sand. Notice how it changes from past to present tense, by the way. Silver cloud lies at the foot of the mountain, the stones speak, and the grass whispers. Philemon speaks these words, and then he leans toward the earth and kisses it and disappears. There are many ecological images in the Red Book. Jung, in many ways, can be considered the first eco-psychologist. This is from Jane Hollister Wheelwright, a Jungian analyst who trained with Jung and who lived on a ranch near Santa Barbara. I finally reached the realization that the divinity still needing human recognition is our own planet, Earth, in our solar system. Earthrise is upon us and is inevitable. The choice that lies before us is whether we embrace it consciously or act it out unknowingly. To align this with this image, try just receiving it. Be in an inner dialogue with it. Feel into what it means when you look at it. Try even asking it for dreams and for inspiration. See what happens. Experiment with the process implied in Earthrise: network, combination, connection, communication, deep relations. Embrace its values: inclusion, participation, diversity, preservation, and relationship. and understand its requirements: no waste, cooperation, sustainability, accountability. And finally, express its ideals: homecoming, transborder community, a true Earth culture. With our view of Earthrise, we could see that the earth and the heavens were no longer divided, but that the earth is in the heavens. Thank you.